all the joists and the platform structure in place, it's time to move on to the house portion of the treehouse. For that, we need some more wood back there, so we're going to bring back the plywood and a bunch of 2x4s. Just to make sure we're starting the house in the right spot, we're going to put in the deck boards for one of the balconies. This way we don't find out later on that we didn't leave enough room for these 4 boards. Looks like our measurements were just about right. The wall of the treehouse is going to line up right on that blocking we installed. Now we can go ahead and start framing and building our 6-foot wall. We're bringing up some 12-foot 2x4s to serve as our top and bottom plate of our wall, and then a bunch of 8-foot 2x4s for our studs. To make life easier, clamp the top and bottom plate to each other. Go ahead and mark out on both plates at the same time where your studs are going to line up. From there, line your studs up with the marks you'd made on the top and bottom plate, trying to make sure it's relatively square as you install these things. And then go ahead and put 2 nails in the bottom and 2 nails in the top. Once you get all your studs nailed in, you'll have something that looks like this. We can go ahead and install our plywood. The easiest way to do this for these bigger walls is to go ahead and screw your plywood onto the wall and then cut off the excess. I found it to be really helpful to use a scrap piece of wood as a guide for my circular saw to help get a nice straight cut. When you're cutting plywood, or any wood for that matter, make sure that you set your saw to be just a bit deeper than the thickness of the wood so you get a good cut. Once all the plywood is screwed in and cut, it's time to lift this bad boy into place. These walls can be pretty heavy once you get them all put together, especially if your wood is wet at all. So they can get a little squirrely on you when you're trying to lift them and get them to sit into place. So I recommend getting a second set of hands if at all possible. Luckily for me, my wife was available to hold this thing level while I screwed in a brace to keep it there. We checked to make sure that the wall was level. She held it steady, and then I had a brace screwed into the wall already. I brought that out at about 45 degrees and then screwed it into the end joist. Once you're confident that your wall is at 90 degrees with your floor, go ahead and take your nail gun or a nail and hammer and nail the bottom plate into the joist, or in our case we can also nail into that blocking that we had installed. One thing that I had overlooked in the original plan was that the outside wall of the house is going to take up the entire width of the double end joist. And so to have something to screw my plywood floor into, I need to install an additional piece of wood on the inside of the end joist. Even if I had realized this problem from the beginning, I probably would have come up with the same solution, so it wasn't a big deal, and I had a piece of scrap 2x6 laying around anyway. Finish this one, then repeat on the other side. The floor is going to take 2 sheets of plywood, and I want the seam between them to line up on one of those double joists, so I'm going to cut this one off at that double joist. Now this seam will line up on that double joist, and I'll have something to screw the ends of both pieces of plywood. Like before, I'm using a piece of scrap wood clamped down to my sheet of plywood to get a nice straight cut. Slide that second piece of flooring into place and screw it down. Before I build another wall, I want to install that second row of blocking that's going to run underneath my other wall. To make sure I get it lined up, I'm going to just chalk a quick line for the blocking. As before, I'm going to cut all my pieces of blocking to length and then nail them in place. Take that thing you took to the bottom and just click it to the bottom and then let go, and it'll come back up. There you go, you're loaded and ready. With the blocking in place and a freshly loaded nail gun, we can start framing our 8-foot wall. Like before, we'll line up our top and bottom plates and clamp them together and then mark out our stud position. The 8-foot wall has a window and a header on the door, so it required a few more shorter pieces of wood we had to cut. Nail it all together and then you have your frame for your 8-foot wall. I did make one modification from the original drawing. Instead of having a stud centered underneath my windowsill, I just used 2 blocks on either side to hold it there. This will work just as well and was a better use of some scrap wood I had laying around already. Because this wall has a window in it, it involves a few more detailed cuts than the other one. I used a circular saw to cut out some big lines for the window, and then an electric jigsaw to finish out the corners where the circular saw didn't quite make it. Then I just had to trim off the little end piece, and the 8-foot wall was all set. Even though this wall is only 2 feet taller than the other one, when you multiply that 2 feet by 7 studs and a couple sheets of plywood, it kind of adds up with the weight. So this one was not going to be lifted by one person, at least not me. After getting a team assist with lifting this 8-foot wall into place, went ahead and screwed in some braces on either side to hold it level. Then we had 2 out of 4 walls up and installed. Then I had to dust off those old high school geometry and algebra skills and start calculating some angles on the side walls. I'll post a link to the video that helped me out with a lot of the math on this, but suffice it to say that for every foot we're going over, we're going up about 5.6 inches. So that works out to a 25-degree angle. When I cut my first couple of studs, I had accounted for 1.5 inches for the 2x4 top plate, but what I had forgot is when you put a board on an angle, the height of the board changes. So in this case, a 2x4 at 25 degrees is a little more than 1.5 inches. It actually ends up being about 1 3/4 inches. So I took my studs back to the saw, cut off an extra 1/4 of an inch or so, and then we were perfect as far as the top plate being flush with the top plates of the front and back walls. Then I brought the pieces down, nailed everything together, and voila! On the side walls I did the same thing that I had done on the front wall, where instead of using a traditional stud underneath the lower windowsill, I just used a couple of pieces of scrap wood supports. Because the side walls are so much smaller than the front and back wall, instead of screwing the plywood to the frame and then cutting it, I was able to just lay down my frame on top of a sheet of plywood, then trace the opening for my window, and then trace the cutoff on the top for the angle above the top plate. Then I can move my frame off of the sheet of plywood, cut the top angle off, and then cut the window out. You do this by doing what's called a plunge cut, where you take your circular saw and hold back the lower guard and then slowly plunge it into the material while it's running. Once the plywood's all cut out, we screwed it to our frame and lifted it up in place. Once the sidewall is in place, I secured it to the front and back wall using some deck screws, screwed through the last stud of the sidewall into the last stud of the front and back wall. Just for good measure, at the top of the sidewall, instead of a deck screw, I used some 4-inch structural screws to secure to the front and back wall. Then we just repeated the sidewall process another time for the other wall. And then we had 4 finished walls screwed into each other, and we were ready to move on to the roof. Next up, cutting our rafters and installing our roofing material.